Welcome to Thoughts Roundup. Happy to be with you today. I want to talk about O.F. Foss, Reverend O.F. Foss. There was O.F. Foss, there was O.R. Foss, and there is David Foss. They were all pastors of, I believe it's Bethel Temple or Tabernacle in Houston, Texas. I preached for all three of them. Now, in order to do that, you have to be at least 88 years old to do that. Now, elder O.F. Foss, he wrote a little book, and it's a powerful little book, and I believe the name of it's What God Hath Wrought. And I was reading a little bit of it today, thinking of how many people I know would like to have the book. Brother Larry Booker has asked for it, and I guess I'm going to reluctantly give it to him. But I was reading a little bit in it, and Brother Foss, elder, was talking about when he first started preaching. He hadn't started yet. He hadn't actually preached a sermon, but he felt called to preach. And he was invited to a revival, and there was more than one preacher. The way I understood it, I got it very quick there in the book. And they were all going out in the woods every day and praying. So out in the woods, he was praying, and he said the Lord gave him a scripture, and he took that scripture, and as he was praying, the Lord just kept adding to the sermon, and he said he was so full of his subject. He could feel it ready to be given. He said, now, Lord, you know I can't just tell him I'm ready. The person in charge of the revival will have to ask me to preach. And so, if it's your will, Lord, let me preach tonight. I believe that's what he said. Anyway, the pastor surprised him and said, O.F., you're supposed to preach tonight. He couldn't believe it. And he was so excited about preaching. And when they turned the service to him, he was letting it go. And he said, I'm sure that I enjoyed it more than anybody else. But he said, when I got through, the people were in the altar praying, and sinners were seeking God. And so he said, oh, I was so full of that. I was so full of the subject, and so full of the fact that they were responding. Said, so instead of doing like I usually do, go to the altar, I went out around the fringes and lapped up the praise for how good I had done. And so he said, next day, he said, I said, you know, I'm sure the people are wanting to hear me. I did so good, I'm sure they're planning on me preaching, hoping I'll preach. So he told the meeting planner, he said, I feel like I'm supposed to preach tonight. So he said, the meeting planner said, okay. He said, I'm sure that he knew what I was in for. And he said, so I couldn't wait, and I figured the people couldn't hardly wait. And he said, I got up. I forgot my text. I couldn't think of my points. I couldn't think of what I wanted to say. And I thought I had such a great sermon on hell. And it just bombed. It went over. It didn't go over at all. He said, I learned something that night. I learned to wait on God, and I learned it was all God. And he said, I'm sure the preacher that was in charge knew exactly what I was feeling and what I was up against. You know, it reminds me of that old saying when the young preacher was in the audience and they asked him to come up and say something. And he swaggered and strutted up there, made a mess. And on his way back down, old preacher reached out and touched him and said, son, if you had gone up like you came down, you could have come down like you went up. I think we've all been there, whether we preach or not. I think we realize we better wait and depend upon God. That's what it's all about. God bless you.